7 years. 7 years since Dara Ose last opened the gate at the end of her driveway without checking first to see who was standing on the other side of it. 7 years of one sentence, delivered so quietly it took people a moment to understand what they had just been handed. I don't shake hands. She had learned to read the half-second of recalibration that followed. The slight backward lean. The pivot from greeting into performance. She had filed enough of those faces away to fill a warehouse. Then came a Tuesday in late October, a cold front rolling off Lake Ontario and pressing the color out of the maple trees along Lakeshore Road, and a man named Shaw Broderick arrived at the gate with a clipboard and a 6-year-old girl asleep in the back of his work van. He was 41 years old, which Dara knew because it was on the contractor form her assistant had forwarded the night before. He worked restoration, old stone, brick pointing, the slow repair of buildings that had been built to last and hadn't quite managed it. He had been recommended by the Heritage Board that oversaw properties in her neighborhood. He had no website. He had 3 references, and all 3 of them had answered their phones. The gate opened. He pulled in. Dara watched from the second-floor window as he stepped out of the van and looked at the house the way a person looks at an old letter, not scanning for information, but reading it for what it meant. The limestone facade on the east side had been splitting along the mortar joints for 2 seasons. The previous contractor had filled the cracks with the wrong compound, and the freeze-thaw cycles had pushed the problem deeper into the wall. She had been told by 2 separate assessors that the east face would need to be repointed before spring, or she would lose the integrity of the corner. Shaw walked the foundation line without taking notes. He ran one thumb along a joint at shoulder height, pressed gently, and caught the crumble in his palm. He looked at what was in his hand for a moment. Then the side door of the van slid open on its own, and a small girl in a red parka climbed down to the gravel with a backpack shaped like a turtle and stood beside his leg. He glanced down at her. She was already looking at the house. Dara turned from the window. She did not go downstairs to meet him. That was what the house manager was for, but she found herself at the top of the staircase anyway, listening to the front door open, and the girl's boots on the hardwood and her manager's polite and careful voice explaining that Miss Ose would prefer to conduct the assessment via a written walkthrough sheet. Then the girl said something Dara didn't catch. And Shaw said quietly, "We'll be quick," and then he came upstairs. Not because anyone had invited him, because the stairs were the only way to reach the south exterior wall, and he had already seen from the gravel outside that the lintel above the second-floor window on the south face was beginning to separate from the stone above it. His boots were clean. He knocked on the doorframe of the study where Dara was sitting and waited. She did not say, "Come in," she said. "I prefer not to have contractors in the private rooms." He looked at the window above her desk. The crack ran from the upper corner of the frame along the plaster to the ceiling. It had been there 2 months. She had caulked it herself in September. "That caulk won't hold past February," he said. "The lintel's moving. Whatever's below it is moving with it. If you want, I can stand in the hall and describe what I'm seeing." She turned to look at him. He had the build of a man who had been lifting things for 20 years. Not gym-built, but load-built. A particular kind of compact weight distributed across the shoulders. His face was weather-rude and currently expressionless, in the way of someone who was concentrating on the wall behind her head rather than on her. He wasn't performing patience. He simply hadn't finished looking at what he'd come to look at. "I have a condition," she said. She had learned to say it plainly, without softening it and without weaponizing it. "I don't shake hands. I maintain distance. I will not be in a room alone, with someone I don't know for more than a few minutes. I'm telling you this so neither of us has to manage the subtext." He absorbed this the way he had absorbed the mortar crumble in his palm, without drama. "The subtext is about the wall," he said. "Can I take 4 pictures from the doorframe?" She said yes. He took the pictures and was back downstairs in under 3 minutes. She came down 10 minutes later and found him in the kitchen with his daughter, the girl's backpack on the table, a coloring page spread between them. Shaw drinking the coffee her house manager had apparently offered without being asked. The girl looked up. "What happened to your hands?" she asked. Dara looked down. She was wearing the thin cotton gloves she wore in the house, cream-colored, ordinary, easy to explain to most adults. "They don't like the cold," Dara said. The girl nodded as if this were entirely reasonable. "Mine don't either," she said. She held up her own hands to demonstrate, bare and pink from the van. Shaw looked at Dara over the rim of his mug with the careful non-expression of a man who had just registered something and was choosing not to comment on it. Dara sat down at the kitchen table. It was the first time in 3 years she had sat at the kitchen table with another adult in the room. They went through the assessment sheet. He had noted 11 problems, ranked by urgency, with estimated timelines and material costs, written in a handwriting so small and precise it looked like drafting notation. He had caught the mismatched compound in the east joints, the lintel separation, a section of flashing along the north parapet that had been installed backward, and a crack in the foundation footing near the back corner that no one had mentioned in any previous report. "Nobody caught that footing," she said. "Nobody was looking low enough," he said. He didn't say it with pride. He said it the way he would say the sky was gray. As information, his daughter, whose name was Prue, had finished the coloring page and started on the back of a contractor invoice. She was drawing a horse, Dara noted, with the instinctive, unself-conscious draftsmanship of a child who drew constantly. "She's good," Dara said, without intending to say anything. "She gets it from her mom," Shaw said. He looked at the drawing a beat too long, and then he looked at the materials list instead. Later, after they had agreed on a start date and she had walked them to the door, Prue turned back from the front step and asked, with the gravity of a 6-year-old asking a serious question, "Does the house know it's sick?" Shaw said, "Prue." Dara said, "I think so. I think that's why it keeps showing me." Prue considered this and then followed her father to the van. Dara stood in the open doorway for 45 seconds after the van pulled out of the gate. She was aware that this was 45 seconds longer than she normally stood in open doorways. The work started the following Monday. Shaw arrived at 7:15 with a young apprentice named. He introduced him without fanfare, just by his first name, Clement. Prue came every day because the school board strike had made arrangements complicated, and Shaw had made no attempt to explain or apologize for this. She sat in the van with a lunch pail and a stack of library books until 10, when Dara's house manager, a woman in her 60s named Winifred, who had worked the property for 11 years, decided without consulting anyone that the child should come inside and eat at the kitchen table. Dara observed this from the hallway. She did not stop it. On Thursday of the first week, she was working at the south window when she heard Prue's voice in the garden below, asking Clement whether mortar was different from cement in the same voice she had asked about the house, knowing it was sick. The voice of someone who assumed that the world would answer if she asked it a straight question. Clement answered in full. He explained the lime content and the breathing properties of historic mortar, and why modern Portland cement was wrong for old stone. And Prue listened to all of it and said, "So the house needs to breathe, and the old stuff let it, and the new stuff doesn't." "Pretty much," Clement said. "That's like a bandage that doesn't let the skin breathe," Prue said. "My dad says those are the worst kind." Dara sat down on the window seat with her back against the frame and said nothing and listened to her house being explained to her in terms she had never thought to use. The second week brought rain. Shaw worked in rain gear on the scaffolding that had gone up along the east face, unhurried, the same steady pace in wet weather as in dry. He did not come to the door to report progress. He left handwritten updates folded in half on the kitchen windowsill, which Winifred brought to Dara without comment. The updates were brief, written in the same small notational hand. East, upper third. Repointed, curing. Flashing replaced, sealed, footing crack. Filled with hydraulic lime, monitoring before full repair. On the 6th day of rain, he came to the back door at noon. Dara was at the kitchen island. She heard the knock and took a moment before she opened it. He had a photograph on his phone. He turned it to show her without coming inside. "Found this in the north wall cavity," he said, during the flashing replacement. It was a photograph of a small glass jar, sealed with a metal cap, set into a void in the stone. Inside the jar, visible through the glass, was a folded slip of paper and what appeared to be a ring. Builders used to do this, he said, sealing something into the wall when they finished. Like a signature. The house was built by her father. She had grown up in it. She had lived in it alone for 7 years. She looked at the photograph for longer than she meant to. "Can I have it?" she said. "When you're done with that section." He said yes. He closed the back door and went back to the scaffolding. She stood at the kitchen island for a while. Then she called her assistant and canceled 2 calls she had been dreading and did not schedule replacements. It was on a Wednesday afternoon 3 weeks into the job that the envelope arrived. It came by courier, not by post. It carried the letterhead of a firm she recognized because she had been watching its movements for 2 years. Strand Capital Partners. The letter inside was brief and professional and asked her, in the measured language of people who understood the weight of what they were asking, to consider a voluntary sale of Osei Research Group, the company her father had spent 30 years building, and that she had run, alone and remotely, since a diagnosis 7 years ago had made the world outside this house impossible. She read it 3 times. The offer was structured around a health clause. Specifically, it cited a provision in the shareholder agreement, one she had not written, one she had not seen before, that tied executive authority to a capacity assessment conducted in person at the company's registered office within 60 days of a formal request by a board member. A board member had submitted the request that morning. His name was on the 2nd page. His name was Porter Lane. She had known Porter for 16 years. He had sat across from her at her father's table. He had been at her father's funeral. The envelope was still in her hand when Shaw came to the back door to leave his afternoon update. She opened the door before he could knock. He looked at her face. He did not ask what had happened. He said, "I have 20 minutes before Clement leaves for the day." "What do you need?" She said, "Come in." He came in. She put the letter on the kitchen island between them and watched him read it. He read slowly and without comment, the same way he read the mortar joints in the wall. When he finished, he said, "The provision in the shareholder agreement. When was it filed?" She was already pulling up the board minutes on her laptop. 11 months ago, she said. Emergency amendment to the governance charter. Passed by a 4-3 vote at a meeting I joined by video because I had a chest infection. Who held the proxy? Porter, she said. For the 2 members who joined in writing. Proxy votes he arranged. She looked at him. He was a stonemason. He restored old buildings. He had no reason to know how a proxy vote worked in a private corporation. My wife's family ran a fishing cooperative, he said, before she got sick. Her brother took it from her using a procedure amendment that passed while she was in hospital. She died before the appeal was heard. He said it plainly. He did not look for her reaction. She sat down on the kitchen stool and thought about 7 years and a charter amendment and a man who had sat at her father's table. "What does Porter get?" Shaw asked, "if the assessment goes the way he's planned it?" "He becomes interim CEO, she said, "during any incapacity period. The Strand offer has a signing window. 30 days, and Porter is on the Strand Advisory Board. He has been for 2 years. I only found that out this morning." Shaw was quiet. The rain had started again. They could hear it on the skylights. She said, "There's more. The in-person assessment has to be witnessed by a board-approved physician. The physician on the approved list. There are 3 of them. All hold appointments at the same university department that received a significant Strand endowment last spring. You can't go to the assessment and you can't skip it," he said. "No, but you have 60 days. 58 now." He looked at the letter again. "The assessment is the trap," he said. "Whether you pass it or fail it, it establishes that you had to prove yourself to keep your own company. And if you go in person, you're walking into a room Porter owns. And if you don't go, the default vote removes you," she said. "Yes, I'm a stonemason," he said. She said, "You're a man who reads structures and understands what's actually holding them up versus what's pretending to. That's what I need." He looked at the rain on the kitchen window. His daughter, Prue, had come inside without either of them hearing her and was sitting at the kitchen table with a library book, apparently reading, though Dara suspected she had not turned a page in several minutes. Shaw said, "What do you know about the physician approval process?" "I know who approves the list," she said, "and I know that the process for adding to it has never been used because it's never needed to be." "Then use it." She looked at him. "The process exists," he said. "If it existed enough to be written into the charter, it existed enough to be activated. You need to find a physician who meets the credential criteria and get them approved before Porter can move the timeline." She opened the charter document. He was right. The approval criteria were broad. She had never looked at them because the list had always been sufficient. She looked up. "You figured that out from one reading," she said. "I spent 1.5 years contesting my late wife's brother's amendment," he said. "I read a lot of governance documents. I lost, but I learned how they work." She turned to her laptop. She turned back. "I need to tell you," she said, "that this is not your problem, and I understand that completely," he said. "My daughter has been eating lunch in your kitchen for 3 weeks. Winifred taught her to make brown butter shortbread yesterday. Prue told me at dinner that this house has good bones and she wants to be the one who fixes them when she grows up." Dara was quiet. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "What do we do first?" The week that followed was one of the most precise and exhausting of her life, and Dara had run a research company through a pandemic from her kitchen island, so the bar was not low. Shaw continued work on the east wall during the day. At night, he came back to the kitchen table with his phone and the governance documents she sent him, and a particular kind of stillness that she had stopped finding unnerving after the second evening. He was not a strategist. He did not pretend to be. What he was rigorous. He looked at a document the way he looked at a wall, for what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be there. Prue had started bringing her sketch pad inside. She sat on the kitchen window seat and drew the room in careful, unpracticed lines. On the third evening, she showed the drawing to Dara, who was across the island from Shaw looking at a charter amendment timeline, and said, "I drew you with your hands showing, but I wasn't sure if that was okay." She had drawn Dara's hands without the gloves. Dara looked at the drawing for a long time. "It's okay," she said. Shaw glanced up. He looked at the drawing, and then at Dara's hands, and then back at the document in front of him, and said nothing. And Dara understood that nothing was the right answer, and that he had known that without having to decide it. On the fourth night, they found what they had been looking for: a physician, a geriatric and neuropsychiatric specialist at McMaster University, who had published 6 years earlier a peer-reviewed framework for remote and home-based capacity assessments for executives with chronic health conditions. A framework that met every criterion in the charter, that had been cited in a Canadian Medical Association policy document, and whose credentials were demonstrably superior to all 3 physicians currently on the approved list. Her name was Dr. Abina Quarte. She had trained in Accra and completed her fellowship in Toronto. Dara had cited one of her papers in a company health policy document 3 years ago. Dara called her at 7 in the morning. The doctor answered on the third ring. She had not expected to be understood so quickly. Dr. Quarty asked 2 questions about the charter language, 3 questions about the nature of the assessment, said she would need to review the credential documentation, and called back in 2 hours. She was willing to be considered for approval. She would not be pressed on a timeline, and she would not participate in anything she considered procedurally improper. And she said this in a voice that made clear, these were not caveats but foundations. "I would not ask you to," Dara said. "Then let's proceed," Dr. Quarty said. The application for physician approval went to the board secretary that afternoon. It arrived simultaneously in the inboxes of the 3 board members who had voted against the charter amendment 11 months earlier. Dara had spoken to each of them that morning. Each of them had been under the impression that the assessment requirement was a formality. None of them had understood that the physician list was structurally controlled. The sequence of what followed happened faster than anyone inside it could fully track. Porter Lane received the application and called her within the hour. His voice on the call was the same voice he had used at her father's table. Warm, intimate, slightly sorrowful. the voice of someone performing concern. "Dara," he said, "I'm worried about you. I think you've been isolated too long, and I think the people around you are not giving you the right picture of what's." "Porter," she said. She had prepared nothing to say to him. She said what was true. "I know about the Strand Advisory Board appointment," she said. "I know when it started, and I know what the retainer looks like. I know that the charter amendment passed on proxy votes you arranged. I know that the physician list was assembled after your advisory appointment, and that the assembly process left no written trail because it was done through informal recommendation rather than formal nomination. And I know that you walked me through my father's eulogy and stood beside me at the graveside, and then spent 11 months building a mechanism to remove me from what he left me." She stopped. He did not speak for 4 seconds. "You can't prove the physician list," he said. "I don't need to prove it," she said. "I need to demonstrate it, which is different." The board sees the credential disparity. The board secretary now has a formal physician application on record. The nomination process is now visible, Porter, because the application made it visible. Every member of the board can now see that the list was built the way it was built. His breath on the line was the sound of a man revising a plan he had been certain of. "You still can't conduct the assessment remotely," he said. "The charter requires Dr. Quarty's framework," she said. "Read her 2018 paper. The charter's credential criteria are met, and the methodology she developed was cited in CMA policy as of 2021. I have a legal opinion confirming that the remote provision holds under the existing language. You have 48 hours to object on procedural grounds, Porter. I would take the time to think about what objecting is going to look like on the record." She ended the call. Her hand was on the kitchen island. Shaw was on the other side of it, watching her. He said, "That was the right call." She said, "I know." She breathed. She said, "I have never done anything like that in my life. I have managed this company for 7 years from this kitchen, without once speaking to anyone who scared me." "He didn't scare you," Shaw said. She looked at him. "He made you angry," Shaw said. "There's a difference. It shows up differently in your face." She looked at him for a long moment. "I work with Stone," he said. "Stone doesn't tell you what's wrong. You have to look at it until you understand." Prue was in the window seat. She was not pretending to read this time. She was watching her father with the evaluating look of a 6-year-old who is filing something away. The formal board vote on the physician application was held remotely, by written ballot, 8 days later. It passed 5-2. Porter and one ally voted against. The 5-2 split meant that 2 people who had been neutral were no longer neutral, which was a kind of victory Dara had not counted on, and which Dr. Quarty, when Dara called her, said she had expected. The capacity assessment was conducted the following week, over 2 sessions, by video, in Dara's kitchen with the lake visible through the south window, and a cup of tea going cold on the island beside her. Dr. Quarty was brisk, systematic, and thorough, and she concluded, in a report submitted to the full board within 72 hours, that the executive presented with full cognitive and professional capacity, no indicators of impairment to judgment or decision-making, and that the nature of her health condition was fully compatible with continued executive function under the company's operational structure. She added one line that Dara read 3 times. "The isolation observed is a management strategy for a complex condition, not evidence of incapacity. It should not be conflated with inability." Porter resigned from the board 17 days after the assessment was filed. He submitted no statement. The Strand offer was withdrawn by the close of the following week. On the last day of Shaw's contract, he reset the final section of stone on the north parapet and came down on the scaffolding in the early afternoon, the same unhurried descent he had made every other day, and stood in the garden for a moment looking at the east face. Clement had already loaded the van. Prue was inside. She had brought her sketch pad, as she had every day for 6 weeks, and she had filled it. Dara came out to the garden with the glass jar from the wall cavity. She had opened it the night before. The folded paper inside was a name and a date. Her father's handwriting, the year the house was built, and a sentence in Twi she had not been able to read until she called her aunt, who had told her, voice catching, that it meant, "What is built with patience will hold." She held the jar. Shaw looked at it. "Did you find out what the note said?" he asked. She told him. He looked at the east wall for a moment. Then he said, "He was right. The scaffolding was gone." The stone was uniform and clean and mortared with the right compound, the kind that breathed with the building rather than against it. The corner that had been failing was solid. You could look at the wall now and not know it had ever been anything other than what it was supposed to be. She said, "I want to offer you the contract for the properties." The company owns 6 heritage buildings in Ontario. All of them need someone who reads structures the way you do. It would be a 2-year engagement, possibly longer. He was quiet in the way she now recognized. "Not absence, but attention," she said, "and I want to ask you something that I understand is not part of a professional conversation and that you are completely free to decline." He waited. She looked at the garden and at the gate at the end of the driveway and at the maples dropping the last of their leaves onto the gravel. "Prue asked me yesterday," she said, "if I would come to her school's Heritage Day. It's a project she's done about this house. The architecture, the stone, the history. She used the drawings she made here." He said nothing. "She wants me to come and hear her present it," Dara said. "In person." He looked at her. The fear in her face was not the fear of Porter Lane and not the fear of the board vote and not the fear of the capacity assessment. It was an older fear. The particular cold weight of a world that had become very small and the terror of its edges. She had managed it and organized around it and protected herself inside it. And in 7 years she had done important work and run her father's company and kept herself intact. She had not been wrong to do any of it. She had not been weak. She had been surviving the only way she knew how. But Prue had drawn her hands without the gloves and asked if that was okay. "I don't know if I can," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I don't know if I can walk into a room full of people with cameras on their phones and noise and no control over any variable and not fall apart." Shaw said, "She's not asking you not to fall apart. She's asking you to come." Dara was quiet. From inside the house, through the kitchen window, they could hear Prue explaining something to Winifred about lime mortar in the voice she used for things she considered important. He said, "When I brought Prue to the co-op meeting 3 months after her mother died, she cried from the parking lot to the front door, the whole way through and the whole way back. She was 5. She told me on the way home that she was glad she went and she didn't want to talk about the crying part." Dara stood in the garden with the glass jar in her hands. She said, "Will you be there?" He looked at her directly, the same way he'd looked at the crack in the lintel above her window on the first morning, seeing it clearly and without making it into more than it was. "Yes," he said. She took a breath. She said, "Then I'll come." The morning of the Heritage Day was cold and bright, the hard November light that makes everything in Ontario look slightly more real than it needs to be. She wore her coat and her gloves and she sat in Shaw's van. The same van Prue had climbed out of 6 weeks ago with the turtle backpack, and did not speak for the first 5 minutes of the drive. He did not fill the silence. He drove the way he worked, steadily, without performance. Prue in the back seat narrated a revised section of her presentation under her breath and occasionally asked her father to confirm facts about lime content. The school gymnasium was loud and warm and smelled like all school gymnasiums. 23 Heritage Day projects lined the walls on trifold boards. Prue's board was at the far end, and it was immediately distinguishable because it was covered edge to edge in her drawings. The house in elevations, the stone details, a cross-section of a wall showing the mortar layers, and in the center, a drawing of 2 people at a kitchen table, one of them with her hands resting openly on the surface. Dara stood in front of the board and looked at the drawing. Other parents came and went and asked Prue questions, and Prue answered them in full, the same way she had answered Clement about mortar, assuming the world would engage if she gave it a reason to. Several parents asked who the woman in the drawings was. Prue said, "She's the one who owns the house." She said the house knows when it's hurt, and she was right. At some point, Dara realized she had taken her gloves off. She didn't remember deciding to. They were folded in her coat pocket, and her hands were at her sides in the gymnasium light, and nobody was looking at them. Shaw was standing close, not performing nearness but simply there, the same way he stood beside a wall he was assessing, present and without agenda. A boy from Prue's class came over and asked if the house was haunted. Prue said, "No. It's just old and it needed someone to pay attention." Dara turned to look at Shaw. He was already looking at her. Something in his face that she hadn't seen on the first morning, or the second, or even the night he sat across the kitchen island from her reading governance documents. Something that had been there all along and had simply been waiting for her to be in the same room as the rest of the world to be visible. She looked at the drawing of her hands on Prue's board. She looked at the gymnasium full of loud, ordinary, uncontrollable people. She breathed. The drive home was quieter than the drive there. Prue fell asleep against the window before they reached the highway, the ribbon she'd been given for outstanding research project work still in her hair. Shaw drove. Dara watched the November fields move past the window, brown and silver, the light going down in the west. She said, "I have not been outside this long in 7 years." He said, "How does it feel?" She considered the question seriously. "Like a wall that's been repointed," she said. "Still the same wall, holding better." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's a good answer." She said, "I learned it from the stonemason." He smiled, not at her but at the road, and she was glad he did it that way because it meant she could look at it as long as she wanted. 3 weeks later, she drove herself. Her own car, the one that had sat in the garage for 6 years with 19,000 kilometers on it. She drove it to Shaw's rental in Hamilton and rang the bell and stood on the front step and waited. He opened the door and looked at her, and she could see him doing the calculation she had done in the van, noting what it meant that she was standing here, not making it into more than it was, but not making it into less. She said, "Prue's drawings. I want to commission them for the annual report, the company's annual report. Architectural illustrations of the 6 heritage properties. Proper ones, printed properly. Her name on them." He said, "She's 6, I know," Dara said. "She draws like someone who knows what a building is trying to do. That doesn't have an age, and I want her paid at the same rate I would pay an adult illustrator, which I am telling you now so there is no negotiation about it later." He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he stood aside. "Come in," he said. "She'll want to hear this from you." Dara stepped inside. The house was warm and small and nothing like hers, and it smelled like dinner and Shaw's particular brand of wood shavings and old paper, and something that might have been brown butter. Prue appeared at the end of the hall in socked feet with a pencil behind her ear, and looked at Dara with the uncomplicated delight of a 6-year-old who had simply expected this to happen eventually. The glass jar from the wall was on the kitchen windowsill. Dara had brought it with her on the drive, without deciding to, and she set it now on the counter beside the kettle, where the light hit the old glass and made it look like something her father had set into a wall on purpose, which of course he had. Building in patience, sealing his name inside it, trusting that someone with the right hands would find it when the time came.